In August 1943, into the hands of the New York police was received a recording of a telephone conversation between mob boss Frank Costello and candidate for the post of judge Thomas Aurelio, in which the former promises the latter a positive outcome of the vote. And despite the fact that this leak resulted in a public outcry and lawsuits, the promise was still fulfilled. Costello managed for more than 20 years to maintain near universal influence over the New York Democratic Party, and yet remain in the shadows most of the time. He managed to avoid serious criminal prosecution at least 5 times, and in the criminal world, he earned the nickname Prime Minister for his diplomatic style of running the organization. Frank was, without exaggeration, the most atypical mafia boss, favoring gambling and racketeering, as well as bypassing drugs and keeping violence to a minimum. He almost managed to realize his dream of becoming a legitimate businessman. Today, I'll tell you the story of a man who reached the top rung of the Italian mafia and managed to stay there for 20 years, with little to no violence. Meet Frank Costello on the other side of the law. I want to ask you to take your mind off the video for a moment and look at this cool print I made for you. If you like it, you can buy any product you like by clicking the link in the description. And of course, every item you purchase contributes to the growth and advancement of the channel. Thank you for your attention, and now let's dive deeper into the story of our hero for today. Francesco Castiglia was born on February 22, 1891, to the family of Luigi and Maria Castiglia. His parents lived in a small Italian town called Larapoli. By the time of Francesco's birth, there were already 5 children in the family, and parents tried their best to feed them. Maria worked as a weaver, and Luigi, before the 6th child, had already managed to change several professions, having been a soldier, gamekeeper, and vineyard guard. However, none of these jobs could allow Luigi to provide his family with everything they needed. It even came to a point where they had to borrow bread from the local bakery. Luigi considered immigration as a way out of this situation, and in 1895, the whole family moved to New York and settled in the area, which at that time was called Little Italy. The move expectedly did not bring golden mountains, and the Castiglia family continued to struggle for existence in the same way. His mother borrowed money and opened a small grocery store, and his father worked as a laborer on construction sites. Gradually, Francisco began to contribute to the family's budget, however, extracting money in a different way from his parents. The first time after the move, Maria managed to keep her son from communicating with criminal elements, but his quickly approaching teenage years brought all her efforts to naught. At the age of 12, Frank dropped out of school and, together with his older brother Edward, plunged into the seething cauldron of street crime. They started with petty theft and organizing dice games called craps for their peers. And then Frank was noticed by a local authority figure, Ciro Terranova, and he began collecting money from local merchants for him, as evidenced by Costello's arrest in 1908 for threatening a coal merchant. Another arrest of Frank occurred in 1912 when he was accused of robbery. In both cases, the young Italian managed to get away with it. By 1915, however, his luck had run out and Costello was sentenced to a year in prison for illegally carrying a gun. A legend would later emerge that this arrest forced Frank to take his head in his hands and permanently renounce bearing arms and personal involvement in violent crime, which is actually an exaggeration and is shattered by several facts. First, in 1919, he was arrested along with Vincent Rayo on robbery charges. Second, Costello's Prohibition-era associate Albert Feldman, who later became a government witness, said in his testimony that Costello, in a conflict with another gangster named Emanuel Kessler, threatened him with a gun. And thirdly, this is an inference rather than a fact, it is highly unlikely that at a time when bootleggers were shooting each other at every turn, Costello conducted business without carrying a firearm, even if only for self-defense. Frank could indeed walk around without a gun, but he had not been doing so since 1915, clearly. After leaving prison in 1916, Costello continued his work for Ciro Terranova, and at the same time pulled off his first gambling scheme. He found a Jewish businessman named Henry Horowitz, who ran what could be called a distant relative of modern slot machines. Horowitz installed in bars small boxes with holes in which were papers with the name of the prize. For 5 cents, anyone could get a special stylus from the bartender and try his luck by pulling out one of the papers. The prizes were usually inexpensive items such as razor blades and the like. Costello invested in the Horowitz about $3,000, as well as helped to find new points for the installation of these ancestors of slot machines. For a year of continuous work, Frank and his partner managed to earn about $100,000, which in today's money would be equal to $1.5 million. However, then the police began to massively arrest the owners of such machines, because of which Horowitz had to close the enterprise, having previously filed for bankruptcy. But Costello did not have to grieve for long from the loss of such good profits. Very soon, the U.S. government will announce the introduction of prohibition law, and he would be able to earn dozens, if not hundreds of times more. As I've mentioned previously, prohibition in the States was seen by the vast majority of the population as a bad joke. There were very few people who really wanted to fight to enforce it. And this applied to ordinary citizens as well as to government officials, ranging from the smallest lowlifes to the highest-ranking officials. The Prohibition period spawned not only thousands of bootleggers, but also widespread corruption reaching the highest echelons of government. For example, a businessman named George Remus paid Attorney General Harry Doherty about $3 million a year at the beginning of Prohibition to keep his cases under wraps. Remus opened a chain of drugstores in the early 1920s for which he could legally produce and buy alcohol, which was then resold for things other than medical purposes. During the first year of Prohibition, George resold about 3.5 million liters of whiskey. Therefore, it is not surprising that Remus was the person who at first provided most of the bootleggers with the goods. Costello, on the other hand, had neither impressive capital nor serious connections at that time. At first, he bought alcohol from big businessmen like Remus and then resold it to bars. To expand the field of activity, Frank turned to a large Jewish gangster named Arnold Rothstein. He outlined to him a scheme where he wanted to establish a wholesale liquor supply in New York and asked for a loan to implement the idea. Rothstein saw the potential in this idea and gave the money to Costello, after which Frank immediately began to realize his vision, which was as follows. There were two islands near Canada called St. Pierre and Miquelon, which were under the jurisdiction of France, where alcohol was not prohibited. Costello visited these islands and agreed on a wholesale supply of alcoholic beverages. At first, whiskey was brought from Europe to the islands. Then local sailors took them to the shores of New York, anchored outside the territorial waters. After that, bootleggers would approach them in small boats and transport the goods to the shore, where they would be loaded into trucks and shipped to warehouses in the city. Another influential person who helped Costello get a successful start in the bootlegging business was Emmanuel Kessler, nicknamed Manny. Kessler was a well-connected businessman who, in the early days of Prohibition, made his money selling liquor from government warehouses, obtaining it by bribing the officials responsible for protecting it. Kessler, as well as Rothstein, gave Frank loans to buy trucks and later bought wholesale, bringing Costello goods, who resold them to bars. In a couple of years, Frank Costello earned more than $1 million. By 1922, he had already finally settled with Rothstein and the enterprise itself to smuggle alcohol, which grew by leaps and bounds. By 1923, when Kessler was jailed on charges of illegally taking liquor from government warehouses, Costello, without exaggeration, already had his own fleet, which included dozens of small boats, large ships to deliver goods from the islands, several seaplanes to look for lost ships, as well as a couple of radios, constantly traveling between the coast and the border of territorial waters to keep in touch with incoming ships. On top of that, most of the Coast Guard was bought and worked for Costello, escorting liquor boats as well as alerting bootleggers to government patrols. Only one man in New York had the same scope in this method of smuggling, William Vincent Dwyer, named Big Bill. And Costello had only two options in dealing with Dwyer: either try to compete with him or to initiate an alliance with Big Bill and take control of most of the illegal wholesale liquor market. Frank chose the second option, and for 3 years of joint work, the Costello-Dwyer organization, according to government estimates, had a turnover ranging from $120 to $180 million, which in terms of modern money is equivalent to $1.5 to $2 billion. It's not known exactly how much Frank Costello received, but I think not less than Dwyer, who in 1926 had about $10 million in his accounts, which in our money equals about $120 million. And that's not counting Big Bill's assets in the form of sports teams he owned. Why did I include the figures for only 3 years of work, you ask? Well, it's because in 1926, Costello and Dwyer were arrested on charges of organizing the smuggling of alcohol and its further distribution. Big Bill was tried first and received 2 years in prison, and Costello managed to get away with it by winning a hard-fought trial. In the future, despite the fact that Frank would continue to smuggle alcohol, he would not face any more bootlegging charges during Prohibition, and Dwyer's prison term would allow him to become, for at least 2 years, the sole leader of the wholesale liquor trade in New York City. Costello, as an ordinary mafia soldier, earned as much, if not more, than the bosses of the then Italian gangs. He, working since his youth with Ciro Terranova, all this time was a prominent member of the Morello family, and then a soldier of the Maciera family, where his future friends and partners were Lucky Luciano, Joe Adonis, and Willie Moretti, as well as a future adversary, Vito Genovese. However, despite the family membership, Frank all along tried to avoid as much as possible all conflicts in which his boss was involved. There is no evidence that Costello took any active part when Masseria was feuding with Umberto Valentini or Salvatore D'Aquila. The only conflict in which he was in any way involved is the Castelmarise War, which I discussed in the Charles Luciano video. But even here, Costello is mentioned only in the sense that he was present in the firing list of Maranzano, as well as supported Luciano in the assassination attempts on Masseria and Maranzano. Nevertheless, this fact did not prevent him at the end of the Castelmarise War from taking the position of consigliere in the Luciano family. This post was obtained by Costello due to 3 reasons. First, he had a good relationship with Luciano. Second, he brought more money into the family than anyone else did. And third, his political connections with and influence on the New York Democratic Party were already quite large at that time. For example, in 1932, Costello attended the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, arriving there with the leader of the party's New York chapter, Jimmy Hines. He, along with Hines and supporters, persuaded that Franklin Roosevelt should be nominated for the 1932 presidential election. This eventually happened, and Roosevelt successfully won that election. Costello's influence on the New York Democratic Party would only continue to grow, as would the capital he made from the liquor trade. After Prohibition was repealed, Frank turned from a leading smuggler into a gambling kingpin and the gray cardinal of an entire political party. It was more than 20 years into Frank Costello's golden age. The main advantage of Frank Costello, expressed in his almost universal influence on the political life of New York, was able to become a reality due to 2 reasons. The first is Frank's ability to find the right approach to people, as well as the talent to build mutually beneficial alliances. And the second was random coincidences of circumstance in which Costello was at the right time, in the right place, and with the right funds. In New York, since the middle of the 19th century, the main political force was the Democratic political party, represented here by a society called Tammany Hall. This society controlled all 3 branches of government in the Big Apple, and any official seeking office had to placate to its leaders. To maintain such influence, the Tammany managers needed constant cash infusions, as well as people on the streets who could, if anything, help recruit the necessary votes. And who in the 1920s had plenty of both? That's right, bootleggers. Gradually, gangsters and politicians began to make mutually beneficial alliances. The former gave money, and the latter protected the former from the laws of the land. And it is at this stage that the secret lies why Costello would later gain such great political influence. If most mafia bosses worked with politicians exclusively in a give-and-take way, Frank went much further. He gained access to the leaders of Tammany Hall through bribes, not just exchanged favors with them, but worked his way into their confidence and made friends, constantly being in the company of politicians. By 1932, when he appeared at a party convention in Chicago, Frank was already a member of the Tammany organization on the West Side, frequently attending its meetings. Costello didn't just pay bribes to politicians. He was able to insert himself into their society and make friends and supporters there. Add to this a high position in the mafia which controlled the streets, and you understand why it is Costello is mentioned as the linchpin between the mafia and politics. At first, Frank influenced power through the leader of Tammany, Jimmy Hines, with whom he had a close partnership, while helping, so to speak, his people to climb the ladder in the Democratic Party. which eventually led to the fact that when Hines was removed from his leadership position, the county leaders were Costello-controlled people. These party figures were Paul F. Sarubi, John DeSalvio, also known as Jim Kelly, Abraham Rosenthal, and Clarence Neal Jr. Each of these men ran a chapter in his district and could influence the election of the head of the entire Tammany Hall. The result was the following chain of command. Tammany Hall is the main political force in New York City. Its leader directs this force. District leaders influence the election of the leader, and Costello controls the district leaders. It's not hard to figure out who actually ran Tammany Hall. Frank Costello, in a little more than 10 years, managed to get into the circles of the strongest political organization in New York, and then helping someone else advance their career aspirations, or in other ways, co-opting the person, made it so that this organization could not work without taking his opinion into account. It is not surprising that in the future, many people seeking public office in New York would come to Frank Costello for help, which would only increase the number of people indebted to him and thus his political influence. However, Costello might never have gotten his role as a Grey Cardinal if not for Prohibition and the huge amount of money it brought to him. It was this impressive capital that allowed Frank to get the keys to the door of Tammany Hall. Costello, unlike other gangsters who after bootlegging went into other illegal ventures, tried to invest in legitimate businesses. He had a company engaged in building houses. Together with his old friend Henry Horowitz, they opened a company that produced ice cream. He owned part of a company that had exclusive rights to distribute Scotch whiskey under the brand names House of Lords and King's Ransom, as well as invested in the opening of clubs and restaurants, the most famous of which was Copacabana. It should also be taken into account that investments in legal businesses in these enterprises were clearly not limited, as in the vast majority of firms owned by Costello, his name did not appear in any way in order to avoid unnecessary questions from the IRS. Frank's biggest investment was in slot machines. By the time of the repeal of Prohibition, throughout New York City were about 5,000 one-armed bandits which owned Costello. Further expansion of business in the territory of the Big Apple prevented only the arrival of the mayor, Republican Fiorello LaGuardia, who, in 1934, a court decision declared Costello's business outlawed in New York City. But this did not greatly upset Frank, and he simply moved slot machines to New Orleans, where his business quietly operated under the auspices of local Congressman Democrat Hugh Long. The firm, which owned one-armed bandits, was recorded by a friend and partner of Costello named Philip Castell and brought in a year a little over $500,000, which in today's money is equal to $6.5 million. In addition to slot machines, Costello was also involved in the organization of gambling. Together with Willie Moretti and Joe Adonis, he had a share of gambling establishments in New Jersey, and in partnership with Frank Erickson, they organized a network of bookmakers across the country. Also, by 1937, when the boss of the family, Charles Luciano, was jailed and his deputy, Vito Genovese, was forced to flee to Italy, Costello became the boss and began to replenish his budget through the interest he received from all the businesses and racketeering under his control. To be fair, it should be said that he only received full power in the family after the expulsion of Luciano to Italy, and before that only carried out the orders of Charles from prison. But this does not negate the fact that Costello was not at all fascinated by the prospect of being the boss. He made a lot of money and considered himself first and foremost a businessman, and the position of boss forced him to involve himself in all of the family's racketeering activities that needed to be managed. And although the boss in the Italian mafia is isolated from the actions of the soldiers, and it is almost impossible to connect him with their actions, Costello during his reign still excluded as much as possible all dirty ways of making money. Under him, drug dealing was forbidden, and gambling and racketeering became the main source of replenishing the family's coffers. That's basically all that can be said about Costello's 20 years as a boss. He didn't do anything that would have radically changed the mafia. Frank, for the time of his reign, practically turned the family into a semi-legal corporation, the main purpose of which was to make money without attracting too much attention. That didn't suit everyone in the organization, as I'll discuss later. However, the majority still supported Frank, as this approach allowed many gangsters to make fortunes, especially knowing that the boss would always be able to help them through his political connections. This is confirmed by the fact that Costello was not removed from the post of boss even when the story surfaced that in the 1940s, for about 2 years, he saw a psychiatrist because of problems with sleep and panic attacks. This fact also supports the view that Costello was burdened by the position of boss, and despite the financial success of the organization and the support of most family members, he was still burdened by psychological issues in everyday life. Frank, in an aspect of his existence not related to the mafia, sought to join with high society, projecting the image of a socialite and not being seen in the company of gangsters, among whom he tried to communicate only within a narrow circle of trusted partners and friends. For this purpose, he even bought a house in an elite village called Sands Point, which was inhabited by millionaires and corporate executives. The Costello estate was located on land with a total area of 1 square kilometer, on which there was a luxuriously furnished house with 12 bedrooms. Here, Frank and his wife spent weekends relaxing from the hustle and bustle of the city. For life in New York, Costello had a 7-room penthouse located on the 18th floor of a building directly opposite Central Park. The apartment was furnished in the old style with paintings by famous artists on the walls and a real wood-burning fireplace. Frank wanted to get into high society the same way he had gotten into politics, with the assistance of money to buy himself status among the elite. To do this, he also donated huge sums of money to the charity organization Salvation Army, where he was one of its 200 largest patrons. But as history has shown, none of this worked, and the reputation of a gangster would linger around him all his life. No matter how white his organization's earnings, no matter how many lawsuits he won, no matter how much money he put into charity, and no matter how quickly Costello tried to escape the reputation of a gangster, his past life and past deeds were starting to come more and more clearly into focus, and would soon bring down the prime minister who was endlessly running away from them. Frank Costello was one of the few gangsters of those years who managed to repel repeated attacks from law enforcement. The first time Costello was prosecuted was in 1926 for bootlegging, when their organization with Dwyer had a rat. One of the captains who carried liquor from the islands fell into the hands of the police and began to cooperate with the investigation. Frank managed to get out of litigation on the grounds that in gathering evidence against him, the police first used wiretaps on his phones without proper authorization, and then embedded an undercover agent in his organization who recruited his men to testify. It's worth noting that at the time, such tactics were new and considered unseemly. In addition to all this, at the trial he was not able to speak to the defected captain, who committed suicide shortly before the meeting. So the jury acquitted Costello. The second attack came from Mayor LaGuardia in 1933-34, when he opposed Frank's slot machines. And as I said, Costello simply moved them to New Orleans. The third time, the Prime Minister was already under the eye of the FBI in 1935, suspecting Frank of facilitating a major robbery and moving the loot to New York. He went to trial the same year, but was released on bail of $10,000, and in 1937, the charges were dropped for lack of evidence. The same 1935 prosecutor, Thomas Dewey, who would only a year later close on Luciano, together with Mayor LaGuardia, first tried to link Costello with the firm, which forced restaurants in New York to buy alcohol only from them. The basis for this was that the whiskey, which Frank brought from Scotland, was distributed through this company. He then decided to involve Costello's bookkeeper, Frank Erickson, in parallel attributing Costello to this case. However, the authorities did not succeed this time, as it was impossible to prove that Frank had anything to do with any of these companies. Moreover, Erickson also managed to avoid imprisonment. Costello even managed in 1939 to avoid punishment on charges of tax evasion. He and his partner Philip Castell were charged with concealing profits from slot machines, and the amount of unpaid taxes on these profits amounted to no less than $500,000. The process, during which Costello for the first time in a long time could not win, happened only in 1950, and the name of the hearing was Kefauver. These Senate hearings took place in 14 cities in the United States, during which more than 800 witnesses appeared before a Senate committee. Initially, the main topic of the hearings was supposed to be gambling, but it eventually evolved into discussions of all aspects of organized crime. The trial itself began in 1950, but Costello's turn to appear before the Senate did not come until March 13, 1951. On the first day, Frank was asked about his Prohibition-era dealings. On the second day, they went through the slot machines and gambling connections, as well as expressed doubts about the veracity of his words, as Costello often avoided questions or evaded answers to them. On the third day, Frank refused to continue testifying, citing a sore throat. However, he still had to continue. On the fourth day, March 19th, he had to answer questions about his role in political circles, and although these hearings did not imply any further punishment for Costello, his evasive answers, as well as the refusal to submit a report on his finances, made it clear to the authorities where and how to hit to finally get the prime minister of the mafia. Large-scale audits of Costello's finances began, and as a backup plan, the authorities began looking for a way to strip Frank of his citizenship and deport him to Italy. At the same time, the clouds were gathering over Costello in the criminal world. In the mid-1940s, right before Luciano's expulsion to Italy, Vito Genovese returned to the States and had several reasons to be displeased with Frank's position as boss. First, Genovese himself had been the first deputy and then the boss of the family before his flight to Italy. And secondly, Vito's main source of income was drug dealing, which Costello strictly forbade. However, Genovese could not immediately unleash an open conflict, as Frank had quite strong allies. Therefore, he had to wait and gather around him those who were also dissatisfied with Costello, and the opportunity for the first blow from Genovese was the Kefauver hearings. Costello's deputy, Willie Moretti, who had about 60 thugs under his command, was in many ways a forceful defense for Frank. However, Moretti was suffering from syphilis, which was causing his judgment to fail him, which happened when he went before the Senate and almost said something he shouldn't have. Genovese used this situation to his advantage and convinced other mafia bosses that Moretti should be gotten rid of before he said something incriminating. And in October 1951, Costello lost his first ally. In addition to Moretti, the Kefauver hearings deprived Frank of another trusted man. In May 1951, Joe Adonis was imprisoned, who in 1953 would be deported to Italy. The icing on the cake was that in August 1952, Costello himself was jailed on charges of contempt of the Senate for refusing to testify, by covering himself with a sore throat. At the end of 1953, Frank was released but immediately subjected to charges of tax evasion. And in 1956, he did go to jail again, this time for 5 years. However, after 11 months, his lawyer got him out of the prison cell for a review of the case. All the while, Costello was busy litigating. Genovese systematically continued to eliminate his allies and at the same time found supporters. And Frank's 5-year prison sentence, according to Vito's plan, should have served to finally take power of the family into his own hands, but was upset by the unexpected release of Costello in March 1957. Genovese, to realize his goal, had no choice but to go on the open offensive. And in May 1957, he commissioned a family soldier named Vincent Gigante to eliminate Frank Costello. Gigante stalked Costello in the lobby of his home and with the words, "This is for you, Frank," pulled the trigger of a gun. The bullet fired into his head pierced his hat and only slightly scratched his skull. The attempt was unsuccessful. Costello was well aware of who had ordered it and why, and as soon as the fuss died down a little, he called Genovese to negotiate. At this meeting, he and Vito agreed that Frank would give up the position of the boss of the family and retire, and Genovese promised that he would not try to kill him, as well as keep all his sources of income for Costello. After leaving his position as boss, Frank would fight another year in court for tax evasion, but would eventually lose and at the end of 1958 would return to prison to serve out the remainder of his sentence, where he would be dealt another blow in the form of citizenship revocation. Although he would not be deported, this fact did not add positively to the situation of the old gangster. After leaving prison, Costello led a quiet life, paid taxes, and no longer attracted the attention of the authorities with his actions. Frank, as they call it, retired. He and his wife lived in an apartment in New York, visiting his estate in Sands Point on weekends. And on weekdays, Costello met with a few old acquaintances who were also lucky enough to live to a ripe old age, having lunch with them in restaurants and returning in the evening home to his wife. He had enough profit from his past investments to live the rest of his days in wealth and prosperity. Costello, after the troubles that plagued his later years, managed to enjoy a well-deserved 10-year vacation and departed our world in his bed at the age of 83. On February 18, 1973, he passed away in the hospital from a heart attack. This was the story of Frank Costello, a story that shows that even in the criminal environment, one can reach great heights by relying on words rather than brute force.